So at the beginning of the year, Tyler RM posted this thread on 2plus2 where he claims that bot farms have taken $10 million off the WPN network, which hosts most notably America's Cardroom. Here is a graph of all the suspected players. They are, as a whole, completely annihilating it. And you can see the year-end results. It looks like this year they've taken at least $3.7 million off the MTT tables. And it seems like they're doing pretty good at the cash games, taking at least $200,000 off since April 1st. But we can probably imagine that these bot farms have been running at least all year, last year, maybe even a couple years. Here in this thread, Tyler does us the amazing service of posting the cash hands of players he suspects are bots. And so we can go ahead, take a look at them and see what is exactly going on. What are these bots doing if they actually are bots? And we can see what kind of exploits they are taking. What kind of exploits can we take against them now that we know they exist? The day after this post came out, ACR probably misguidedly put out a challenge, and they had Chris Moneymaker and Ebony Kennedy basically tell people, if you can create a bot and you can get it to operate on ACR, you're going to get $100,000 and a job offer to be on their security team, which is on its face ridiculous because now we have ambassadors of ACR encouraging its own members to cheat. What happens if you created a bot just for this challenge and then you got banned? Essentially, you were trying to work for the company and then they are now going to be punishing you for the rest of your life. So a little bit strange. I'm sure someone already created a bot and is trying to claim their reward, but ever since then ACR has backtracked. What these two ambassadors do say, and I'll let you watch this video for yourself, is that there are no bots. There is nothing to worry about. And today I am going to show you absolute proof that there are players who are playing in a very robotic manner, and it's probably because they have the same underlying AI or program running them. So first off, let's take a look at some of these hands. So I have 788,000 hands from these suspected bots. And what I already am going to imagine is that they are positive in their red line, and they're probably generally good at running people slightly off the road. But because they're going to be so monofaceted, it's very unlikely that they're going to have a gigantic win rate. When we look at what their graphs look like collectively, indeed, they are red line maniacs, and their non-showdown winnings are their showdown winnings are pretty poor. I mean, this is the kind of graph that you also expect from some crushing players, right? So it's probably likely that a lot of these programmers realized, oh wow, there are a lot of auto profit bluff situations in poker, and we can profit across all of the stakes simply by executing this. This might be a less nuanced plan than a lot of coaching for profits services offer, etc., etc. However, what this also kind of says is that really dumb robots making no kind of nuanced reads are probably consistently beating players who have been studying poker their entire life, right? What does that say about the state of the game that these robots, which are extraordinarily predictable and very, very poor actual poker players, are capable of beating 200, 500, 1K, 2K, etc., against players who are more trained? So let's take a look at some of the statistics that we think that these suspected bots are going to be playing like, and let's compare them to some of the individual players who we are suspecting. So as a whole, these bots have a 1-win soft flop of 51. They go to showdown half the time. They win at showdown half the time. They go to showdown about a third of the time, a little bit less. When we look at their pre-flop stats, 17, 22, 31, 46, it seems pretty normal. These are, pretty close to stats that you should be having, but we do notice that these players are getting very out of line in the small blind. This number should be in the 40s, but here they're really trying to run you over with 56% small blind steals. And then after you 3-bet them, this is very notable, they fold 65% of the time, they call 27% of the time, and they criminally under 4-bet you. If we actually go into GTO Wizard and we see, oh, how often should we be 4-betting in this spot, you'll see that at 500 rake, we should at least be 4-betting 20 to 21% of the time. So when we see players who are 4-betting only 9% of the time, it gets very sus to me, particularly when you move up in stakes, because how did you get to these stakes if you are only 4-betting, so rarely? This also might be the case where these players are over-folding and under 4-betting simply because they are raising so many more hands pre-flop. But when you actually look at the composition of their calling and 3-betting range when they 4-bet out of position, you'll see that there's just way too many instances where they're calling hands like ace-jack offsuit, king-queen offsuit, ace-queen offsuit, etc., where these hands are just very likely to be 4-bets. So it doesn't really make sense, and I think that these guys simply do not know what they are doing in this one particular spot. They fold to 3-bets, pretty standardly between 55 and 60% of the time, depending on what position and formation you are in. They 3-bet about 11% of the time, but here again, they 4-bet out of position only 13% of the time, particularly cutoff versus button or small blind versus big blind. I expect this number to be 20 or above. I think, the small blind should be 4-betting like maybe 24% of the time, depending on the exact rake structure. You can really kind of, really go wild there. We also see that there are occasionally some limps, some limp folds, some limp calls, some limp re-raises. What is also very noticeable is here, I have statistics of how we should be playing versus a button steal. I'm sorry if this is kind of small font if you're not used to looking at hand to note. But we can see that when the button steals, we are 3-betting 17% of the time. When they steal with a small sizing, we're 3-betting 19% of the time. So we are really, really pushing our pre-flop aggression very, very hard in the big blind. And you'll notice here, when we 3-bet by position, the big blind is actually 3-betting close to, if not more, than the small blind. And this is actually the opposite. Usually the small blind should be 3-betting 0.5% or 1% more than the big blind, who has more reasons to flat closing the action. So it's curious to me that the big blind is 3-betting 17% of the time and the small blind is 3-betting the button 15%, and then it goes to 9 to 8, 7.5 to 7.2, etc. So this is something we're going to be looking for in suspected players. Do they 3-bet more from the big blind than the small blind? Are they really coming after opponents really, really hard, particularly when they try to steal for 2.0? And are they criminally under 4-betting out of position, particularly in the cutoff in the small blind? Because it's just very, very unlikely if you're opening 31% from the cutoff that you should be 4-betting only 13% of the time. This probably indicates some kind of poor programming, because again, I think it's just very, very unlikely that you make it to modern 1K, can do all of these other pre-flop things perfectly, but then here you have a couple of very obvious gaping holes. When we look at post-flop, there's a particular 4 numbers that are popping out to me. Here, their entire betting strategy looks like something like 2/3, 60% of the time, 2/3 again. Okay, so I have a little sticky here where I can write down what are some similarities, and so they criminally under 4-bet cutoff VBU and small blind VBB. They wildly over raise in the small in the small blind. Post flop, they bet 66 street by street. There's actually one more thing that I want to point out when we look at these suspected bots, when we see how much they 3-bet big blind versus small blind. Now, this is the spot in the game tree where you probably should be 3-betting the most, something between 15 and 20%, depending on your exact rake structure. But here we see these guys really, really taking it over the top, going up to 27%, and we can see that they're 3-betting some hands that probably just don't make your 3-betting range, hands like 7-5 offsuit, Jack-2 offsuit, etc. In this spot, also when you 4-bet them, they fold 70% of the time. So we're also looking for players who are wildly 3-betting big blind versus small blind RFI, then folding to 4-bets. Here, in single raise pots, their folding frequencies are absolutely out of this world. So for example, facing a 25% bet on the flop, your opponent should be folding, they should be over-folding the flop, but this should be, 25% of the time-ish. Your opponents are folding way more. you know, facing a 1/3 c-bet over a very large sample. They're folding half of their hands. As the sizings increase, they fold a little bit more. They get a little bit more inelastic around the upper part of the potting range. But it's very, very interesting that they are just really getting out of the way post-flop, yet somehow maintaining this very, very positive red line. Something that they're also doing, sorry if I'm skipping around a little bit, is that you can see that this is how they bet on the flop. And so they bet quarter very, very infrequently. They mostly center their strategy around 1/3, 50, or 75. But they also very rarely pot it, and they very rarely overbet the flop. So again, over 785,000 hands, I find it incredibly incredulous that collectively all of these players have never overbet an ace-king high flop. They've never overbet a 9-8-3 flop, etc., right? None of these guys have invested in these ideas as a whole. Seems a little sketch. Here, after they c-bet small on the turn, we can see that they're often going to be betting either, you know, between 60 and 80%, or they're going to be putting in the small overbet, but they're never using just pot size. Again, this seems a little bit questionable to me because pot size is definitely one of the preferred sizings on the turn, particularly on like a, you know, a queen overcard, etc. So I'm also going to be looking for players who play these exact schemas, right? So no flop overbets, no turn pot bets, right? And so these are things that maybe you'll just miss with a tracker, but when you have hand to note and you have all of these detailed stats, you can kind of pick up these general ideas. I think that it should also say, you know, wildly overfolds to aggression, BBV, the RFI. Let's pick a couple players completely at random and see if they are going to be playing like these bots, if they're going to be showing us these bot similarities. Let's pick Opaly, who I suspect is a bot. We can see that his went to showdown, won at showdown, won soft flop. Very, very similar. He is stealing way too much from the small blind. He is criminally under-raising both in the cutoff and in the small blind. He's wildly 3-betting big blind versus small blind. And here, at least in one section, we can see that he's 3-betting more from the big blind than the small blind. The rest might be a little sample size based. When we look at how he bets from street to street, we were looking for 66, 60, 66. I think that 67, 60, 64 will qualify as being very, very close. And here we can see on the flop, he has never made an overbet, and on the turn, he's never potted. This is starting to look pretty suspicious. Does he really wildly overfold to flop c-bets out of position? Absolutely. We saw that number was 60 in the overall bot pool. Now, this might also be the case that Opaly just makes up, you know, a 1/10 of this, so his stats are naturally going to influence this pool or this alias more than the rest of this. But so let's pick another guy, Stylebender. Stylebender has similar showdown stats. He 3-bets a lot from the blinds. Here, he definitely is 3-betting more in the big blind than he is in the small blind. He's going really, really crazy big blind versus small blind. He's really going crazy in the small blind and then criminally under 4-betting. Although here he is 4-betting more in the cutoff. Good for you, Stylebender. You know, looking at some of these post-flop hands, I actually wonder if there are human operators behind them that are making some like extra decisions. So is it possible that they just have some kind of like baseline guide that is telling them what to do, and then they can use a little bit of their own decision making? I'm actually not sure, because some of these players are, you know, playing a little bit differently, but it's also possible that there's just a lot of variance, particularly when they're only aiming to have a 2 to 2.5 big blind win rate. But now when we look at his post-flop stats, we can see, you know, it was supposed to be 66, 60, 66. This is, you know, 2 out of those 3 numbers match very, very well. And then also we see that there's no overbets on the flop, and there are no turn pot size bets, or not even pot size, but 80 to 1, right? So there's never just going like 80%, 90%. They're all just using the exact same size scriptings. That seems kind of interesting. Here again, we look on the flop, and there is just no way that a professional grade player is going to be folding this much, right? Like once you notice that a bot is wildly overfolding, all you need to do is then essentially raise that bot a huge percent of the time and then try to run them over. But I guess that's why, you know, when you look at their programming, they're 3-betting you so much from the big blind. It's probably so that they can not get into this scenario. So again, style bender. This guy Woodpecker, right? And so now we can see that, you know, while Opally and Stylebender were winning, now Woodpecker is a more break-even player, and you know, with his variance, you know, he is a losing player over this sample. But again, really, really crazy. You know, pre-flop, his big blind 3-bets more than his small blind. His big blind 3-bets the small blind like crazy. He defends against steals like crazy. 66, 60, 66. We're definitely in the ballpark. This guy does occasionally pot the flop. Good for him. Still has never found a flop overbet, which is, again, you know, very, very odd, and just criminally overfolding the flop. I think the barrel fold percentage we saw from the suspect pool was exactly 59, and here we see Woodpecker also getting that 59. Let's look at Whippersnapper, another guy who I think is a bot, and as you were just casually glancing at these stats over and over, it immediately becomes apparent what's going on. This guy has that same effect where he's 3-betting more often from the big blind than the small blind. He's 3-betting way too much from the big blind. He's got 66, 60, 66. He really folds a ton on the flop. So again, on one hand, again, it is very interesting that we can quickly identify. Something else I noticed is that if you look up all of these players on StatName, if you go into their games, you'll see that they basically play all of the stakes through the high stakes. So they both have 100, 200, 600, etc. And so this is not to say that these players are not capable of going from the small to the highest stakes. If you actually look at Stefan on StatName, you'll see that he has 25 no-limit hands and $20,000 hands. But what is the likelihood that every single one of these players is playing almost all of the stakes across the entire room? I mean, just mathematically, there are so few players who make it to 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, 5,000, etc., that it is just really, really unlikely that each one of these players has individually made it into the top 0.001% of poker, or are even in that spot, given their skill sets and win rates, to be able to take shots at these games. So it's just very, very strange, particularly some of these guys who are losing players over their samples, that you see all of them moving to the mid and high stakes, up and down, making sure that no one at the same limit is recognizing the similarities in their play. Identify these players, but then not beat them, because you should be able to look at these stats collectively and develop a counter strategy that is going to be very, very good, particularly if they're not paying deep attention to what you are doing. Once you recognize that these bots are playing this way, how should we, probably play against them? We should 4-bet them a lot when we are in the small blind. We should 4-bet them more generally in a bunch of different spots. We should 3-bet them in a bunch of spots because they're not 4-betting enough. We know that they are going to be overfolding way too much post-flop, so we definitely should just, raise and get in position as often as possible, and then just, c-bet the flop and take it down. But then maybe barrel them less with bluffs by the river, because we expect them to possibly have a strengthened range, even though when we look at how often they are folding over a large sample, we actually probably can still barrel them in this situation. But, if ACR is saying that there are no bots on the site, they must either be incompetent or they must be being deceptive, because there's absolutely no way that a reasonable player with any kind of statistical analysis experience would be able to look at this pool and not realize that there are a lot of players who are playing not just, suspiciously similar, but it is a complete statistical impossibility for all of these players to be playing such close frequencies and playing such obviously similar betting styles and betting patterns. Again, if you're just casually looking at these opponents in Hold'em Manager, maybe you're going to notice some of these, smaller nuances. But once you see that their, bet check, bet frequency, and single raise pots is exactly the same, you see that they overfold to donks in a bunch of spots, you see that they never really wants to overbet the flop, then things get a little bit strange. What is the likelihood that 40, 50, 60 players are all playing with the exact same incorrect GTO approximation? I think that's just not going to be possible. So if you're working for ACR and you want someone to come help you fix this problem and figure out these people, you want to give 100K to your boy, holler at your man. But otherwise, if you are playing on ACR and probably Bovada, it becomes important to realize that there are a lot of bots going around. They're all playing pretty poorly, but they're still going to be taking tons of money out of the pool, and it is definitely stacking things against you. On the other hand, games are still very, very good on some of these sites, even with the presence of bots. It definitely means that you're winning less, but there are still so many recreational players that it's making up for it. So, you know, even though that there are people using RTA at 510 and 1020, the games are often still so good on Ignition, and there are so many obvious players who are dumping money that it actually makes the grind a little bit worth it. Still, hopefully, ideally, we can live in a world where we don't have to worry about this in the first place. This is Alvin Teaches Poker. Stay safe out there.